Okay, for today's class, we're reviewing enzymes, the glycemic index, diabetes, and the main part, the new material today is fat metabolism. Going to be talking about fatty acids and going over the metabolic pathways involved in fat metabolism. So a few review questions for you here. Who would most likely be endurance trained? So an individual with a high ratio of lactate dehydrogenase H to lactate dehydrogenase M, or someone with a low ratio. So to answer a question like this, you have to think about which enzyme is in the mitochondria and which one is in the cytoplasm. So the key is that your mitochondrial enzymes increase with endurance training, whereas your cytoplasmic enzymes, the ones outside of the mitochondria, don't really increase. So for this 1A question, lactate dehydrogenase H is a mitochondrial enzyme. It's involved in the conversion of lactate to pyruvate in the mitochondria, whereas lactate dehydrogenase M is a cytoplasmic enzyme, so outside the mitochondria, and it's involved in the conversion of pyruvate to lactate. So if you have a high ratio of lactate dehydrogenase H to lactate dehydrogenase M, it means you have a lot of mitochondria and you are endurance trained. So the answer for the first one is a high ratio, would be more likely in an individual that's endurance trained. 1B, an individual with a high ratio of phosphofructokinase to citrate synthase, or a person with a low ratio. So again, you have to think about which one is the mitochondrial enzyme. Citrate synthase is found in the Krebs cycle, which is in the mitochondria, whereas phosphofructokinase is found in glycolysis, which is outside of the mitochondria. So a high ratio of phosphofructokinase to citrate synthase would mean that the person is not endurance trained. So if you had a high amount of citrate synthase relative to phosphofructokinase, that ratio would be low. So if you divided phosphofructokinase concentration by citrate synthase concentration, it would be low in an endurance trained person because the citrate synthase is high relative to phosphofructokinase. Another way of saying that is the phosphofructokinase is low relative to citrate synthase in an endurance trained individual. So they would have a low ratio. Does insulin stimulate or inhibit the mobilization of fats from adipose tissue? So insulin is this hormone that tends to pack things away. So it would inhibit the mobilization of fats from adipose tissue. So during exercise, you have mobilization of fats from adipose tissue, you get breakdown of fats from adipose tissue. They eventually go to the muscle where they're used for energy. Insulin counteracts that effect. So insulin inhibits the mobilization of fat from adipose tissue. It tends to promote fat storage instead. What type of carbohydrate is best to consume before exercise for stimulating fat oxidation? The answer here is low glycemic index. So high glycemic index carbohydrates result in a faster and greater rise in blood glucose levels, and that stimulates release of insulin into the circulation. And insulin, from the previous slide, inhibits fat mobilization and fat oxidation. So your low glycemic index carbohydrates, they will result in a lower rise in blood glucose and a slower rise in blood glucose and less of an insulin response. So that smaller insulin response will allow you to have greater fat oxidation. So the answer here would be a low glycemic index carbohydrate would be better for stimulating fat oxidation during exercise. Last question for this review is which type of diabetes can be substantially alleviated with increased physical activity? The correct answer here is type 2 diabetes. So type 2 diabetes often occurs in people that are overweight or obese chronically, and that's because they have a chronic increase in blood glucose and a chronically high level of insulin. So what happens in that condition is your muscle loses its sensitivity to insulin, becomes resistant to the effects of insulin, and it can no longer take up adequate glucose. Type 1 diabetes is characterized by a lack of insulin production from the pancreas. So it's kind of an inherent condition where there's a problem with the pancreas. So type 2 diabetes, if you reduce your level of obesity or overweightness, that can reduce the amount of glucose in your blood and lessen the release of insulin, so that your muscle does no longer would become resistant to the effects of insulin. With exercise, you also get an increase in the glucose transport proteins in muscle. That's going to help to get glucose into the muscle in a type 2 diabetic. And you're also going to get an increase in muscle mass, which helps to alleviate type 2 diabetes because you have a greater capacity for glucose uptake into muscle, which is a glucose consuming tissue. For type 1 diabetics, exercise is still important because type 1 diabetics are more susceptible to cardiovascular disease. So anything you can do to reduce cardiovascular disease risk is beneficial for a type 1 diabetic. So exercise is still recommended for a type 1 diabetic to alleviate the complications associated with type 1 diabetes. But type 1 diabetes can't really be eliminated with increased physical activity, whereas type 2 diabetes largely can be alleviated with increased physical activity. So your correct answer here would be B, type 2 diabetes.